So there are two pieces of research that I looked to primarily in building what I'm going to call a gliding path from memes where they existed when they were written in 1976 to memes where I want them to exist in a field of ethnography and cultural studies and social sciences. One is The Selfish Gene, which Richard Dawkins wrote in '76. Chapter 11 is the only chapter in the book that even mentions the word memetics, memes. And then this other piece of research, I had to read that title over and over. That's the most absurd title for any journal ever written by Zainab Arsal and Craig Thompson. And it's actually a really fascinating piece of research with just an absurd title. So I built this sort of notion in my head that I could get from memes as biological science to memes as ethnography and cultural studies if I could somehow kind of move them along in my argument through existing social sciences. And I want to point out again here that the purpose of this paper is to start a dialogue, to ask questions. So maybe this is not true, but in the very beginning I wanted to say if we could establish memes as a part of biological science and then move them through an existing field of study like behavioral sciences, for example, then can we get them to ethnography, all the while maintaining the scientific rigor to be considered valid? I hope so. So I'm building the gliding paths through the argument. So the first question I had to ask myself is, can memes meet the standard of evolution required for their sister concept, genes? Because if they can't, then they are, in fact, scientifically invalid, and the rest of my discussion is sort of moot. And that would stink, because then I have a whole lot of paper left to fill in my capstone thesis. I don't want to do that. Though I could just put up more cats.
Not what it is.
So there are three concepts required that genes have to have to survive. And they are longevity, fecundity, and copy fidelity. The ability to survive, the ability to reproduce quickly, and the ability to reproduce accurately. And even if you are not a huge fan of evolution, you can agree that conceptually these three things are going to be required for anything to be successful ever. They're sort of the basic fundamental building blocks of everything. And so I figure if these three things have to be valid for genes, maybe we can make them valid for memes too somehow. And so I applied a humanization argument to the meme. I said, hipsters are sort of memetic. Maybe hipsters can fall, like maybe these three categories can be applied to this personified example of memes. Maybe as a concept it's too abstract, but maybe as a population we can begin to study it. And so that's what I did. And I said, in a very basic sense, memes, the hipster as meme would need the ability to survive, and it's been around for at least 70 years if it was coined in 1938. So, that's not a tremendously long time in the overall scope of cultural evolution, but it's a pretty long time considering the advancements that we've had in the 20th century. For anything to exist for 70 years in a recognizable form in the late 20th century in America is fairly impressive. So I'm gonna say that longevity is a check with the hipster as meme combination. Fecundity is the ability to reproduce quickly, and hipsters, there are a bunch of them. In the paper I delve into a little more research that explains kind of where they are and where their population growth occurs, and I'm willing to say that, there aren't as many as there could be, but in general terms they've reproduced fairly quickly. And then with copy fidelity, I actually ran into a bit of a challenge because the hipster as meme has not reproduced entirely accurately. It's been in a different form in every milestone along the way, but still ultimately recognizable through differences in language, through differences in dress and taste, and I'm going to say that hipster as meme meets the requirements for copy fidelity as well. So I was able to say that hipster as meme, which is one now meme complex in the overall argument, meets roughly the same requirements as the biological science definition of what it requires for a gene to be successful. And that is where my understanding of biological sciences stops. There is no more, and I will be discussing it no more in the paper, here, anywhere else, because biology is really hard, and this is communication school. behavioral science is something that is much more comfortable in this environment, because behavioral science is really rooted in marketing and in business, and not necessarily in cultural studies. It has more of an end game in mind. But it's still a generally accepted scientific principle, and it still involves the study of people and their actions and their interactions specifically. So I figured my second step would have to be saying, can we study meanings ethnographically in an accepted scientific field? And I was very fortunate that a couple of people have already done this for me. There are Zainab Arsel and Thompson, who I mentioned earlier, and then to some extent there's even Irving Goffman, who I think that Kenyon mentioned a little bit earlier, who gave us the theory of framing, or the notion of framing, as a means to answer the overall question, what is going on here? And if you think about any subcultural definition, that's really what it's about. They're trying to figure out what's going on, and they're trying to subscribe to a particular group. Arsel and Thompson asked themselves this question in their consumer research, which I think is a valid question, specifically because they're trying to figure out how best to market to this hipster subpopulation. They want to figure out how they can sell things to them. And they determined that there are three things that distinguish hipsters in consumer research: aesthetic distinction, symbolic demarcation, and proclaiming consumer sovereignty, which, if you sort of extrapolate in their terms, are actually pretty good identifying markers of the hipster. Now, the reason I particularly like this piece of research, and despite its absurd title, is that the way they come to these three points is completely through ethnography. They ask questions, they observe, they triangulate back to a shared meaning of truth between their research subjects. They don't rely on basic surveys with a right or wrong answer. They look completely qualitatively at the research. And so we have people who exist in this marketing science field who are doing cultural research, and it's a really convenient way to say the hipster is mean complex is now moving a little bit further down my simplified expression. Let me give that one a check too. And I'm fortunate that Arsel and Thompson did most of the work for me. I will say that Arsel and Thompson did not extrapolate the data the way that I would have, because they have an end game in mind, a real marketable goal. I took their research, but not their conclusions. Their conclusions were completely irrelevant to the rest of my study. And so my third step has to be building an ongoing conversation about medics framed in ethnography using other subcultural examples. I have said in a very, very preliminary way that the hipster meets certain classifications, certain qualifications to be considered a medic, and they can be studied ethnographically, but can other things be studied ethnographically in this way? Can we personify means in using other populations? Can it be the suburbanite who the hipster hates? Can it be the, I don't know, maybe. So there are sort of 5 easy steps in the appendix of my paper, and this is where I will end. I like to think that I can really simplify 30 pages into 5 easy steps. I'm going to try. These are the 5 steps that it takes me to get from biological sciences with a discredited theory that's 30 plus years old and has gone really nowhere in the intervening years, to ethnography, which is sort of a burgeoning field and a useful and popular field to our particular area of expertise. So, if step 1, gene complexes require longevity, fecundity, and copy fidelity in order to be considered scientifically valid, then the hipster, as a personification of the mean, meets the same scientific requirements. Therefore, the hipster as mean, note the punctuation that makes it all one point, concept is valid. And again, this is where the biology ends. So if the hipster has been studied by recognized behavioral scientists in order to be understood as a subculture vis-a-vis communication, consumption habits, then the same scientists use ethnographic research to best understand the hipster, then the hipster as mean can be understood to exist in the same space as ethnography, which means that the simple expression that I've created before has been completed in 5 easy steps. And once this argument is completed, we begin to see that a theory, though discredited, is not necessarily invalid. It may be, it may not be recognized in the field in which it was written, but that doesn't decrease its value in an alternate field or in a parallel field. And thus ends my discussion.